Okay, in this part 3, we're going to continue with our discussion of chapter 5. We left off with a discussion of that continuum, which I highly advise you to sketch out. Remember, on the far left side of that continuum is too much culture, or you can almost say like an infinite amount of culture. And a label we might use there is depressive psychosis, for the reasons discussed in the last lecture. And then on the far right extreme, which would be no culture, we would have the schizophrenic, again for the reasons discussed in the last lecture. Right in the middle, we would put quote-unquote the normal person, the statistically prevalent number of people. Kierkegaard also refers to them as inauthentic. They have the normal amount of neuroses, in other words. That's most people, right smack dab in the middle. And then what about the anal person? Well, the anal person, remember, for whatever reason, needs more culture than the average or normal or inauthentic person in order to make it through their day. So they're highly culturized. So where would we place them? Well, clearly they belong left of the normal person in the middle. Right, not quite as far out as depressive psychosis, because they do, of course, have a certain amount of individuality there, but yet they have way more culture than the norm. So they belong left of normal. Now, what about the introvert? Well, the introvert is someone that is kind of doing their own thing, right? They sort of march into the beat of their own drum, so to speak. But again, they're not totally estranged excuse me, from culture, but they are doing their own thing to some extent. So clearly they belong to the right of the quote-unquote norm. Kierkegaard, the reason why he's important here is because he noted that the individual needs to transcend their cultural being in order to have a true relationship with the absolute. Right? So you need to attain something like self-transcendence, which would be pulling yourself out of culture to some extent. Not being a slave to culture, not being inauthentic, before you can have a true relationship as an individual, not as a member of a culture, but yet as a true individual. And in that way, you can have a true relationship with the absolute. So in this way, he is both an existentialist and a theologian. So there's a lot that can be gleaned from this basic idea, because basically Kierkegaard is saying to be a true individual, you need to be merely more than just a cultural or a historical person, right? You need to be more than just inauthentic. You need to be authentic. You need to be somewhat independent. You need to transcend your culture and your religion and your historical place to some extent. So hence the relevance of Kierkegaard to this general discussion. Okay, we're skipping chapters 6 and 7, just for the sake of time. You can certainly read them. Move to chapter 8. Near the beginning of chapter 8, Becker discusses romantic love, which is a quasi sui project, in other words, a self-caused project that we engage in to help us deal, right, with the terrors of reality and to help us deal with anality. But romantic love is doomed to fail for a couple of reasons. Number one, it will involve the sex act, and we've already discussed the problems involved with the sex act itself. It continues to wake in us our awareness and continues to remind us of our basic animal condition. So that's one issue with romantic love. And another issue is that we embrace these partners. We make them part of our project. And in the beginning, they seem to be wonderful in all ways, but inevitably they begin to show signs of quote-unquote decay and imperfection. And so our allusions towards immortality are thwarted to some extent. So romantic love is another cultural project we engage in that in the end is doomed to failure. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that couples don't live long lives together. But you can talk to anyone who has been, let's say, faithfully monogamous for a long period of time, and they really have to work at it. I mean, there's a reason why the divorce rate for first-time marriages is about 50%. Okay, chapter 9. Nice quote here in chapter 9, and I might have mentioned this at the beginning of the lecture 1, but Becker notes the essence of normality is the refusal of reality. So let's think about that for a second. Let's talk about that for a second. The essence of normality. In other words, to be normal. Remember what that means. It means to be inauthentic, to be a cultural being to some extent, to repress the individual. And so the essence of normality, doing that, is the refusal of reality. Well, of course, I think you understand that at this point. Eventually, though, some people begin to have more trouble with their cultural fantasies, their religious fantasies than others. Those who are extra critical, for example, begin to question things. And so at that point, the door is open somewhat for neurosis. Right? Remember, which is just distress, psychological distress, not full-blown psychosis. So in this context, religious doubt, in other words, can lead to neurosis of some sort. And that's why we speak of people having a crisis of faith. I think that's one of the ways to understand that. Now, some people do manage to cope with that by either A, buying into another cultural fantasy, in other words, another form of their religion or another religion entirely, or by buying into materialism or atheism or humanism. He talks a bit here in this context about what was going on during the onset of enlightenment, and he uses the phrase the curse of modernity. And the curse of modernity is simply that. We, as a culture, many people no longer accept the cultural or religious response to reality. And with the onset of the Enlightenment, which is also sometimes called the Age of Reason, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, people begin to question the authority of tradition and culture and religion, and they begin to rely on reason and empiricism for truths about the world we live in. And that's what he refers to as the curse of modernity. We're thrown back on our own devices, at least those who are atheists, freethinkers, materialists, and so forth, because they've rejected the notion of God and religion and the afterlife and a given meaning and purpose and so forth. So that's the curse of modernity he speaks of. Again, many individuals manage to make it through that crisis by totally buying into one of those ideologies I just mentioned: atheism, freethinking, materialism, scientism, and so forth. He concludes the chapter by noting that regardless of everything else he has said thus far about culture and religion being fantasies, he does note that religion actually provides answers that help us solve some of these problems. I mean, think about it. Religion, at least I should say, religion claims to solve the problem of death. Religion claims to give us meaning and purpose. So at least religion provides a way. It's a hero system, a particularly powerful one for those who buy into it. Look at page 203. Bottom paragraph. Best of all, of course, religion solves the problem of death, which no living individuals can solve, no matter how they would support us. Religion then gives the possibility of heroic victory and freedom and solves the problem of human dignity at its highest level. The two ontological motives of the human condition are both met. The need to surrender oneself in full to the rest of nature, to become part of it by laying down one's whole existence to some higher meaning, and the need to expand oneself as an individual, heroic personality. Finally, religion alone gives hope because it holds open the dimensions of the unknown and the unknowable, the fantastic mystery of creation that the human mind cannot even begin to approach. The possibility of a multidimensionality of spheres, of existence of heavens, and possible embodiments that make a mockery of earthly logic. And in doing so, it relieves the absurdity of earthly life, all the impossible limitations and frustrations of living matter. In true terms, to, quote, see God, unquote, is to die, because the creature is too small and too finite to be able to bear the higher meanings of creation. Religion takes one's very creatureliness, one's insignificance, and makes it a condition of hope. Full transcendence of the human condition means limitless possibility, unimaginable to us. Now, I probably don't have to point out to you at this point that Becker is an atheist, so he's kind of like Durkheim in a way. He doesn't buy into the claims and dogmas and beliefs of religion, but he sees a positive role for religion. Even though in the end, remember, he refers to religion as just another hero project, another fantasy that helps us cope. Okay, in chapter 10, there's a discussion of sexual taboos, and I think you can probably guess where this is going to go at this point. Clearly, sexual taboos are humankind's attempt to control his animal side, right? And not to let animality rule over us. We may be animals, but we can at least overcome that with our cultural do's and don'ts, etc. And of course, that's how we get to the notion of sexual perversions. This is part of the Causae Sui project, the cultural project that we embrace to help us deal with anality. And then chapter 11, the last chapter, Becker notes that clearly human beings are not gods. So we must indulge in psychological repression to some extent. In other words, we must repress, ignore, whatever, nature and reality, at least to some extent, if we're going to lead quote-unquote normal lives. But these character lies, our culture, our religions, our trivialization, in fact, of reality, which is a good way to look at it, right? We don't see reality in stark, real terms. We see a trivial version of it. But these things are all necessary if we're to lead, quote-unquote, normal lives, and if we're to function from day to day in our world. So on the issue of religion, one wonders exactly how ingenuous Becker is being. I mean, he speaks rather positively of it, but you do realize the entire text is one long critique regarding the truth value of religion and culture itself. These things are all fantasies that help us cope. But as Becker says, they're useful fantasies. There's a great quote to end with here on page 282. So read with me. I always end my discussion in my classroom with this quote. We are, let's see, 3, 6, 9, 12, about 15 lines from the bottom of page 282, and I'm going to continue to 283. So it starts, what are we to make of a creation? So I'll let you find that. About 15 lines from the bottom, page 282. What are we to make of a creation in which routine activity is for organisms to be tearing others apart with teeth of all types, biting, grinding flesh, plant stalks, bones between molars, pushing the gulp greedily down the gullet with delight, incorporating its essence into one's own organization, and then excreting with foul stench and gases the residue? Everyone reaching out to incorporate others who are edible to him. The mosquitoes bloating themselves on blood, the maggots, the killer bees attacking with the fury and the demonism. Sharks continuing to tear and swallow while their own innards are being torn out, not to mention the daily dismemberment and slaughter in natural, quote-unquote, accidents of all types. An earthquake buries alive 70,000 people. Automobiles make a pyramid heap of over 50,000 a year in the U.S. alone. A tidal wave washes over 250,000 people in the Indian Ocean. Creation is a nightmare spectacular taking place on a planet that has been soaked for hundreds of millions of years in the blood of all its creatures. The soberest conclusion that we could make about what has actually been taking place on the planet for about 3 billion years is that it is being turned into a vast pit of fertilizer. So any doubts regarding Becker's materialism, Becker's atheism, I think are dealt a blow there. Clearly, he is an atheist and a materialist. But Becker is a cultural anthropologist first and foremost. Right? So he has studied culture and studied religions. And this is his honest, frank, ingenuous take on things. That's how you should look at it. It's not a matter of Becker insulting anything. That's if you're thinking that way, you've totally missed the point. This is his take on things. And it's a very impressive, very plausible take on things. One of the reasons it is such a robust hypothesis of human cultural behavior is that it helps us understand so much, and it explains so much.